Hello YouTube. Today I'm here to talk to you about intensity and how no one really grasps that very simple concept, which is a problem because it's one of the main variables of programming and therefore one of the main variables of growth in terms of muscle. The very idea and concept of intensity is widely discussed on this platform by both bodybuilders and powerlifters, but I have seen in the last few years a certain degradation of the discussion around the issue, where I see more and more people who have weird gimmicky aspects or approach that have been integrated in their heads of what intensity supposedly constitutes, that then leads them to questionable training practices that result in no progress in terms of hypertrophy. So I want to make sure I correct these potential misguiding information and fix the way you perceive intensity, because no one truly understands intensity. So every single programming variable, be it volume or frequency, at some point become mimified, meaning that they start taking a life of their own because the community starts to appropriate them, which is great. We want people to learn about them so that they can apply it. But of course, when you pass down information to a large group of people, there comes a time where that information starts to degrade because people start to interpret it with their own subjectivity. The issue is when these very same people start to regurgitate that information as gospel without realizing that they modified it. And that modification leads to then entire subgroups who are going to follow what essentially now constitutes wrongful information and therefore get results that are more than lacking in terms of muscle growth. It also makes the concept more obscure. And this is sad because in reality, intensity especially is a very simple concept to grasp. It's not something that's complicated or rocket science. And yet I see so many people having different definitions of what it is that I perfectly understand why I have sometimes novices who come to me asking me, hey, what exactly is intensity? And they know what it is. Actually, deep down, you know instinctively what intensity is. It's just that it's now being covered by such thick layers of lingo that it has lost its meaning. It's very obscure and it shouldn't be. Programming is simple, and sadly, it has become more and more complex for no actual reasons or benefits. Now, when we're going to talk about intensity per se, I first need to explain to you a very simple fact, but a fact that I know a lot of people don't actually intellectualize enough. Intensity isn't a feeling, right? We're not talking about the feeling of intensity. I'm not discussing whether or not you feel intense. That has absolutely nothing to do with intensity in terms of programming. It must be said because the two are widely confused. There are people who think that if you feel intense, therefore the workout is intense. They confuse the feeling of hard work and putting in the work with the actual, observable results or even parameters of set training. And that is a problem because we are leaving the realm of programming. Now we're in the realm of emotions. While your emotions, when it comes to your program, don't really matter besides the aspects of it that concern whether or not you like the exercises you're doing. So that's something that needs to be said because intensity is very simply a number. That's what intensity is. It's not, again, anything special or hard to explain. It's simply a number. A number you can put on a piece of paper that is objective. It's objective when related to you. The subjectivity aspect happens when you compare your intensity to others. Now, let's discuss why people have started to believe that intensity is a feeling in the first place. I think this comes from the glorification of lifting and also the very masculine energy that comes with it. Lifters like to present themselves as warriors and soldiers, and I do myself also engage in that type of talk. Why? It's motivating. It also is, in a sense, awakening a type of spirit and vital energy that is lacking in men nowadays, and that therefore we need to reappropriate. But it does not mean that the concepts that constitute the programming aspect of the the sport or sports in general have to follow suit. We can't be barbaric in the weight room and scream and fuck shit up without having our practices be the exact same thing. Because at the end of the day, that's what happened to intensity. People have started to associate the two. They think that being aggressive in the gym constitutes intensity. Well, no, you can do curls with 5-pound dumbbells, the big dumbbells, and be super aggressive. That doesn't make it intense. You can swing them as much as you want. It's not intense. And it's something that escapes the grasp of many people, where they still don't understand that just because the pro bodybuilder, for example, is going to scream and grunt, or they're going to do the leg press, and then they're going to lay on the ground, that doesn't mean that the set was intense. It could constitute cardiovascular expenditure. It could also constitute theatrics. A lot of the time, these people play it up for the camera. The problem is that they know that, I hope, but that the viewers don't. So then you end up with Skinny McGee in the gym who is going to do sets of 20 on the leg press and just copy his idol without realizing that what he's doing is not intensity. Same for powerlifter fanboys who are going to see their hero squat 900 pounds and scream his head out with blood shooting from his nose. Yeah, that's intense because it's his 1 rep max. But when you load 1 plate and you scream after each rep, it doesn't make the set intense. It just makes you look stupid. So that is something that needs to be debunked. And after that, you take that same mindset and you apply it to every other applications of intensity. Anything that is not the raw number on the piece of paper is not intensity. So for example, the speed with which you lift doesn't constitute intensity. I don't care how fast you lift, it doesn't make the lift any harder. It does not constitute an intensity percentage. I don't care how slow you lift also, it's not a good indication of degree of exertion. I have people who don't grasp that. The speed with which you lift has nothing to do with RPE. Some people like me lift slow. You can look at the way I deadlift or squat. I do 1 rep and you would say, okay, that's a 1 rep max. Then I do 5 more. Why? I lift slow. Some people are much more explosive in their way of lifting, but neither of these constitute intensity. Just because someone is going to grunt and grind a deadlift for way too long doesn't mean that they're being particularly intense. It could be 90%. For me, it's 90%. And just because someone explodes off the floor doesn't mean that they're more or less intense either. These are just visual cues that don't constitute intensity. And that goes for the difficulty aspect as well, at least the one that you see with your own 2 eyes. The difficulty and the subjective application of it does matter for intensity, but that's from lifter to lifter. It's not something that you can actually observe, because intensity is both subjective and instinctive, meaning that even if you have never heard of intensity before, you can still train intensely. That's a big misconception with programming also. Programming exists in nature. The concepts that we utilize have always been utilized by people who lifted or practiced sports. It's just that we have entered an age of information where we finally categorize and catalog everything and we give it names. But the lifters in the 1800s still used intensity. Why? Because they would also use rep ranges and weights that would trigger fatigue. So they used high intensity, and we use the same thing. So even if you were never made aware about the very concept of intensity, you still might have been training intensely. And I would even argue that many people who have never actually went on YouTube Fitness or gotten any information in that regard actually train with more true intensity than people who have the knowledge, because those who have might have been led astray. They might have received bastardized versions of intensity and they end up thinking that it's everything but a number. And because it is a number, we have, as I just said, ways to capture it. So how do we capture intensity? Well, the favorite and 2 methods that YouTube Fitness are going to propagate the most are RPEs and percentages. Both of them are valid. I think that both of them can be utilized by bodybuilders. I personally have a preference for percentages. But it's still specific to each individual because, and that's what I said earlier, it's a subjective notion. So intensity for you is not intensity for me. And that goes for weight selection, it goes for rep range, and it goes for set selection. Meaning that you could see someone, again, deadlifting 120 pounds, that for you would constitute intensity of 30%. Maybe for him, it might be 90% because he might just be that weak. That is not a problem. See, that's also something that I blame and pin on the intensity crew, the intensity tribe. It's people who are going to say, oh, well, if you don't have at least this much on the bar, then it doesn't count. Well, that's nonsense. Whatever the weight on the bar, if it's challenging, it is intense. Intensity is not annexed via the person in the gym who lifts the most. That's ridiculous. But I think it shows also that all of the people who say that tend to not train very hard themselves. They look at people who train hard and they say, okay, that's intense, and I'm going to judge what intensity is and should look like based off of that. That doesn't work, and it also breeds bad practices that pushes lifters and novices to stay away from intensity because they think that it's reserved to like an elite class of lifters. Like you need to wait until you can deadlift 600 pounds before you have to train intense. No, that's nonsense. We all have to train intensely, but it needs to be put in line with our own specific needs. And after that, we can also discuss the way intensity is measured with the RPs and the percentages, because to be able to use them precisely, at least if you want to program, you're going to have to test your 1 rep max, because these two metrics are based off of the 1 rep max. It's an RPE based on RPE 10, so the 1 rep max, or it's a percentages based off of 100%, which is the 1 rep max as well. And yet, it is also perfectly possible to utilize intensity without having ever tested your 1 rep max. And I am personally a good example of that. I haven't tested my 1 rep max in maybe 4 years. I still use intensity in my training. Why and how? Well, it's very simple. It is, in a sense, coming from the 1 rep max, but it does not mean that you need to either train 1 rep maxes or even know your 1 rep max to utilize them properly, at least if you use them instinctively, something I'm going to come back to later, because if there are people who are way too off the mark when it comes to what intensity is, there are also those who know it's a number, but who don't realize that it's a subjective and instinctive number, and therefore they're going to always write it down, and if they don't see it written down, they're going to consider that it is not technically intensity. Intensity is not tyrannical. Intensity is a value that exists whether you like it or not. So whether you choose to prescribe yourself an intensity before you train or not doesn't matter. You will still train with intensity. It might be an intensity of 10%. It's still an intensity. And so it's also possible to train with high intensity if you wish, without having to actually calculate or prescribe anything prior to the lifting session. But, and more like, and it also means that, as I said, there is no need to actually do 1 rep maxes to train intensely. If anything, 1 rep maxes are terrible for bodybuilding. And this is pretty widespread knowledge, but I know that some people have never really actually heard that. And so it's important to discuss exactly why. First off, 1 rep maxes are a skill, meaning that it is something that you develop. You develop the ability to put in 100% of your strength for 1 rep. A skill that is particularly important for powerlifters. For bodybuilders, it's not. It would be if there were any benefits to doing 1 rep maxes for hypertrophy, but there aren't. So there's already the problem of investing technical points in a, again, skill that you're not going to use. After that, we can discuss why you will not use it. First and foremost, the injury risk. When you lift 100%, you are coming very close to the red zone. The red zone is the percent or the portion or the area where you take the most risks. It does not mean that 1 rep maxes are dangerous. It's not what I'm saying. It's that they're more dangerous than reps. Why? Because it's all or nothing. It's 1 rep. So this means that if something goes wrong, it's all concentrated on that 1 rep with super maximum loads. If you do a set of squat at 70% and something goes wrong on rep 3 and you feel a pop in your lower back or something and you feel pain, well, you got injured with a sub-maximal load. So the degree of severity of the injury is greatly reduced. Whereas if the same injury happens with 100%, not only might you not get the weight up, but if you do, the injury might be worse. So that's the first problem. And the first reason why bodybuilders should avoid 1 rep maxes. After that, there's the question of the tonnage. Even though it is 100% intensity, so it's very high quality, you would still get more tonnage if you did 2 reps. So if you can deadlift 500 pounds for 1, and let's say you can do 485 for 2, you're always better off as a bodybuilder doing the 485 for 2, always, because it's twice as much tonnage. And on top of that, it's less injury risk. After that, you can discuss the strength portion of it all, which one has a better carryover for strength. A lot of people will tell you that if your goal is to perform on a 1 rep max, it's the 1 rep max. But for bodybuilders, we accumulate strength to boost tonnage. So there would be absolutely no point in sacrificing tonnage in the instant to pursue strength. This is something I covered in length in the hypertrophy series, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But keep in mind that tonnage is king and strength is just a way to grow your tonnage over time. And then there is the fatigue aspect. Both in terms of the fatigue you will feel from the 1 rep max and the one you will be lacking from the 2 reps. I explain. A 1 rep max, a true 1 rep max is going to sap you because it's a true full-on effort. And for the people who have actually tried, you will find that if you did a 2 rep max instead, even though you lifted more weight in terms of tonnage, you will feel less mentally taxed and physically drained as well, even though technically that makes no sense. But it's something that I find to be true across the board. So you get less overall fatigue, you get less injury risk and more tonnage if you repeat a lower intensity that is just below your 1 rep max, which is only beneficial for people who bodybuild. So I truly, unless you enjoy them for some reason, encourage you to stay away from 1 rep maxes. But that, as I said, also raises the question of the very use of intensity if we're not going to use a 1 rep max, because a lot of people see that the two are connected. They see intensity as being based off of 1 rep maxes, so they think, okay, well, that means that 1 rep maxes should be part of the training. Well, no, that's not how it works, because you can very easily determine your 1 rep max without actually doing your 1 rep max, because if an intensity of 70% exists, it also means that it exists whether you write it down or not. And that's what I meant when I told you that focusing on the number aspect can become dangerous. If you go in and you put 200 pounds on the bar for the squat and you can get it for 10 reps, that already is telling you about your percentage and about the intensity you must use in your training, not only for that lift, but for every other lift. You didn't need to do 1 rep max. It works best for powerlifting because their entire training is focused around getting a 1 rep max, not for us. For us, it's annexed off of reps. So for bodybuilders, it makes much more sense to actually find out your RP or percentages off of reps. And I encourage you actually do it that way. Because your intensity evolves with your reps and sets. Another aspect of intensity that no one understands. People see intensity as a fixated number because of the 1 rep max. They think, oh, RPE 10. Well, you can do a set of RPE 7, for example, and at the end of the set, your last rep is not an RPE 7. It might be an RPE 10. Why? Because you accumulate fatigue as you go. And that is also why those sets tend to be less injury prone, is because you start low intensity. But by the time you're getting to an apparent high intensity, it's not actually that intense. Meaning that there is a real difference between, and I'm sure I coined a term that I forgot, but there is a difference, I remember now. There's a difference between relative intensity and absolute intensity. A 1 rep max for 100% is absolute intensity. That's what you get. It's 1 rep of 100%. If you did 5 reps at 80%, the first rep has an absolute intensity of 80%, but every single rep that follows enters the realm of relative intensity because it artificially increases, but it's not technically a real absolute intensity. So, to go back to the previous example, if you did your 5 reps and the last one is technically 100% intensity in terms of exertion, the way you feel, in reality, it's not 100% absolute intensity, but it was enough for the muscle to think that it was, because the muscle was fatigued. And that is how bodybuilders should approach intensity. We should game it. We should game the system. There's absolutely no reason to do a 100% true 1 rep max when we can get the same type of stimulus for the muscle with less risk. And the reason why there is less risk is that even though you perceive the weight to be 100%, this is only due to fatigue, a fatigue that only concerns the muscle and not really the structure. So even if something went to go wrong, you're still not actually handling a load that represents an absolute intensity of 100%. That is the magic of it all. It's the magic of reps. It's the reason why, and many people have absolutely no idea why, bodybuilders train with reps. It's not just that that's the way it is. It's that what makes the most sense. But until you understand intensity and the way it evolves, you will not be able to actually understand why we always tend to prioritize reps. It's because intensity grows with it. And it grows with the sets as well. If you do 2 sets, both with 200 pounds on the squat, both with 5 reps, your first set and the first rep might be 80%, but the second set and the first rep of second set is not 80%. It might be 81 or 82. Why? The muscle is pre-fatigued because you already did a set. So the more you go into your training, the more tired the muscles are, the more the intensity increases. And that is an excellent news. Why? We open the training with strength training, which is and should be the highest intensity in your entire program for the day. And you could tell me, okay, this means that this is the most important portion because it's the highest intensity. No, it's going to pre-fatigue you so much that any lift you do afterwards for the same muscle is going to be in an absolute, in a relative intensity that is artificially increased. So it's still relevant. If you do 3 sets of hard squats, then you do 3 sets of back off post squats, you could tell me, well, on paper that's junk volume because the intensity is much lower than what I did before. Well, the intensity of what you did before justifies the intensity that follows because it makes it harder. There is, of course, a limit to that. That limit being defined by the intensity window. The intensity window that dictates that if we are to always accumulate high intensity, we have to always keep an eye on the absolute. And this is why I'm not saying to not use percentages or RPEs. I'm saying, however, to not base them off of the 1 rep max. The reason why we still keep an eye on that intensity is because this is your bracket and this is the intensity window. It ranges from 95 to 96% to around 60%. That's your striking range. You want all of your sets, your working sets, to be within that range. It evolves depending on the person. The problem, if you lose sight of your percentages, is that you might start to enter this side of the spectrum, between 20 to 60%. We don't want to be there because that's junk volume. These are not relevant reps. And worse than that, they're not relevant in relative terms or absolute terms. Because if you do a set of 40% intensity, for example, how many reps do you need to do before you enter any relevant intensity window? Way too many. So you waste those reps, and most likely you will never actually get into the interesting part of the intensity range because you're going to fatigue beforehand. The lactic acid is going to accumulate, the pump will stop you, etc. A perfect example of that is, look at your 1 rep max on the squat, or at least your actual, on aurait dit fantasmé en français, fantasized 1 rep max because you have never actually tried it on the squat based off of your reps, and then look at how many reps you can get with 135. Even if you are a very strong squatter, like you can squat 500 pounds, I guarantee you that the correlation between a set of 135 and a set of 500 will not match. And not only will it not match, it's going to be completely different, meaning that based off of the 500, you should be able to do 135 for what? 80 reps, 90 reps, maybe even more. And yet you will not be able to do that. unless you take massive long breaks with the bar on your back. Why? Because the lactic acid and the pump is going to stop you beforehand. So you're going to be artificially prevented from reaching the intensity that you want. This is why we stay within the relevant intensity window, because even though intensity is independent, right, to measure methods, as I already explained, whether you write it down or not doesn't matter. It still doesn't mean that we cannot keep an eye on the challenge that they offer. And so we need a challenge bracket, and that is the intensity window. So just to sum it up and recap quickly, bodybuilders do not need to train 1 rep maxes. They don't even know to know their 1 rep maxes. All they need is to know the striking range where they can do intense work. I already explained the percentages that I believe make up that bracket. That bracket needs to be kept in your head, because the more you train, the more fatigued you're going to be, the more the relative intensity is going to kick in, the more the bracket is going to start to shift. Because a set that was really difficult at the start of the workout, or at least would have been relatively difficult, like 80%, the more you advance into the workout, the more the bracket does this. And so that set starts moving towards the 90 and the 100% even. But you see what that is doing? Your intensity window is moving into junk volume territory, because based off of the principle of absolute intensity, we must look at what you can do when you're rested to determine the rest of the workout. And when that bracket starts entering those waters, that's when you go home, because you know that you fatigue the muscle. The muscle is so fatigued that you cannot produce an effort that is relevant anymore. So it is time to go home. I say that because I already can see the problem that what I'm preaching could actually create. It could lead to people who are going to reject lower reps and only do high reps and do a ton of sets, because at the end of the day, that's a way to game intensity without realizing that what they're getting is not high quality intensity, it is still junk volume, but their fatigue is tricking them into thinking that it's not. So, yes, 1 rep maxes are high and pure intensity, but you can receive the same intensity with reps as long as you keep an eye on the percentage or the RPE. And on top of that, you get the repeatability aspect, which trumps intensity in the long run because it constitutes more tonnage. It is always better, and mark my words on that, always better to do 3 to 4 sets of relatively high intensity compared to 1 set of pure high intensity, especially when you consider that if you have the ability to do 1 set of 4 with a certain weight, you should be able to get the same weight for at least 3 reps afterwards. So for the people who are going to put all of their eggs in the intensity basket, you don't understand intensity, because intensity is also correlated with volume and frequency. So sets and reps, as I already proven, have an impact on it. So someone who does 3 sets of 240 pounds on the squat gets more tonnage and a higher intensity of work than someone who does 1 set of 250 and calls it a day. In terms of comparison, yes, the set of 250 is higher in absolute intensity, but it's the same comparison between the 1 rep max and the 2 rep max. You might have gotten more intensity and pure intensity for that 1 set, but I did 3 sets. I have 3 times more reps as you. So even if my weight is lower, my intensity is higher, because intensity adds up. It's the reason why I said it's independent. Every single rep of the set is its own intensity, right? 70%, 72%, 74, etc. It rises until you fail. And when it fails, you should be at 100%, which means that if they are independent, they also have to be added afterwards to calculate the complete intensity. So a set of 70% or RP7 is not represented by the first rep or the last rep or the middle rep. It's represented by the sum of all of the reps. So it might actually be an 80% intensity set. It's something to keep in mind. If you only focus on one number and you think that this is intensity, you will lose sight of that reality. But as I said, this is the way bodybuilders should train, because intensity in the realm of hypertrophy should be used via multiple short bursts of energy, meaning that every single set should be intense, followed by a recovery period if needed to repeat the intensity. The idea that you have to be intense, or you are to be intense one time defeats the very purpose of intensity, because the concept of intensity includes the idea of a refractory period to replenish your reserves and go and be intense again. We do that day by day as bodybuilders, okay? You train and then you come back the next day and you train again. We do the same thing within the workout. You cannot allow yourself to be intense once. Intensity is based off of repetition. Without repetitions, intensity is lacking. And a good comparison of that is sprints versus fartlek. A sprint is a short burst of energy for a determined period of time and a determined distance. A fartlek is different. A fartlek is an alternance, I think, of jogging and sprints. And the very existence of the jogging allows for the sprint, but the sprint in itself is the actual goal. You jog to be able to sprint. And when you do that, you accumulate more sprints. And for us, the sprints are represented by top sets, high quality sets. So always see your training as such. It is not a sprint. Even in spirit, it is not a sprint. It's fartlek. It's a succession of jogging periods and sprints. The sprints being, of course, the most important. And that is possible and very doable. And the only thing you have to do is, again, not use your 1 rep max to calculate anything. You just have to go to failure. Because you can obtain the very same benefits that RPs or actual calculated percentages would give you by simply going to failure with the proper rep range, which means also the proper intensity windows, because an intensity window is a rep range. It's the reason why I push evolving rep ranges with such vigor, is because they give you a nice and correct idea of what intensity is. It's a bracket, right? An evolving rep range is a bracket of 4 to 8 that represents an intensity based off of your own weight selection, of course, because it's independent and subjective, but it's still an intensity. And once you understand that, you can do away with RPs and intensities. It's the reason why, if you look at my programs, I have never in my life, in my free programs, written an RP or intensity percentage ever. And yet, I have thousands of people running them with no problems. Why? Because the rep ranges I write constitute intensity. And I also trust you to not be an idiot and to go to failure every single time. So you're going to, by yourself, modify the weight selection to match the rep range. And this is how it's done. Once you match the weight selection with the amount of reps, you get intensity. And the proper one out at that, because the rep ranges I select are also going to always keep you within the percentages I believe to be most beneficial, because I am going to, on dit calquer en français, I'm going to mimic the intensity bracket that is relevant with the relevant rep range. And both of these I already discussed in the hypertrophy series if you wonder about my preferred hypertrophy rep range. And so, to conclude this video, I want to say also that intensity as a practice is made sustainable by everything I already described, so it's not going to be a sprint. And it's also added by a good control of your frequency, because if the reps and the set have an influence on intensity, so does the frequency. If you do a set of 5 reps for squat with a given weight on Monday and you do the same on Tuesday, guess what? The intensity of the set on Tuesday is higher because you hadn't had time to recover. So if our goal is to always keep an eye on absolute intensity, that is very relevant. It is very important. You need to be able to know whether you're entering a workout fatigued or not. Doesn't mean that you can't enter a workout fatigued, but you have to understand what it does to your intensity. It is artificially modifying it. So that is the recovery aspect of the thing. And then we can also discuss reps in reserve, which is something I'm a big fan of, because it's also a way to always stay within the intensity that you like and prefer without entering the red zone. And that is modified from lift to lift. For me, on the deadlift, for example, I have a rep in reserve of almost 0, meaning that I usually go all the way. I almost go to 100% with reps, never with a 1 rep max, with reps. But there are other lifts like the squat where I don't want to do that. I want to stay below 95%. So I implement reps in reserve. Why? Reps correlate with intensity. By taking out the last rep of the set, I am in a sense subtracting the most intense rep of the set, which is the rep that could have gotten me to 100%. So it's a sacrifice because it's the highest quality of tonnage I could have gotten, but it's also a safety measure because this is also the most dangerous rep of the set. And if I decide that the investment is not worth it, then I can just take it away. So see reps in reserve as that. It's a safety measure to put in place to control your intensity, nothing more, nothing less. Because when it comes to intense bodybuilding training for us, for people who care about aesthetics, I believe that we should see it as a fire. Intensity is a fire that needs to burn throughout the workout, okay? And if you have ever actually lit a fire, you know what it means. The fire sometimes is strong, sometimes it dies down, you feel it, it gets strong again. But that is a constant source of energy, and a source of energy that needs to stay there for all of your training, meaning that you never let the fire go out. What you don't want is intensity to be like an explosion, be it an explosion of emotions or an explosion of numbers that are not correlated with sustainability. That might work for strength athletes, and even that is questionable because a lot of them use reps still. But for us, it certainly doesn't work like that. Bodybuilding training is not fireworks, it is a slow and steady feeding of a fire that is going to get you what you want, aka muscles. But for that, you need to understand intensity, and I think that this video did just that. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.